we have in front of us a little booklet, and it starts by saying Women's Torah and Chiba and Yummy Desserts. So thank you for organizing this, and thank you, Zelly, for hosting and giving me the opportunity to share with everyone. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to read with you what I wrote there at the bottom, which kind of gives you an outline of what we're going to do tonight. So the mitzvahs of the Seder night. The night of the Seder is a long evening, lots of things to say and lots of things to do, and there's lots of mitzvahs. So if you read with me the paragraph there that I wrote, I said like this: our Haggadahs are filled with detailed and preordained instructions for an organized Seder. That's what the word Seder means. Like Seder in Hebrew, order. Seder means an order, right? You pick up your Haggadah and you just follow what it says from beginning to end, right? And it's done that way so that it's organized in a straightforward fashion, follow 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So as I continue here, the intent is that by following through, we will have fulfilled all that is required to us by the Torah, rabbinic instruction, or custom. And this is what I want to focus on. What happens is we go through the entire Seder, and because it's presented to us in the same book and one follow the other, we kind of get lost with like, what are the highlights? What are the most important parts? What are less so? And like, where should I stop and like pay attention? And where are the things, if I missed it, okay, it's not like the end of the world. And we can lose that because it's all just presented in one long continuous instruction. Do this, do this, do this, do this. So what I'm going to do is we're going to get an overview and highlight what are the various different mitzvahs we are doing, so that when you hit them in the Seder, you know what you're doing, you know what you have to do. And we're going to include with each of these items the meaning behind it. So we'll look at the mitzvah, the details, at least the general details of how to fulfill the mitzvah, and then the meaning behind it. And then when you see it in your Seder, you'll know to look out for them, right? Because otherwise you kind of go through the whole thing, you're not sure where you are, you're just kind of following one after the other. Where's the important part? Where's the less important part? What's required? What's custom? What's maybe? What's I must? Right? So those are the kinds of things I want to address today. And when we understand what everything is at their core, then we'll really get an appreciation, I think, for the Seder, for the order. Okay, so let's look at the top of page 2. Okay. So for the purposes of this class, we're dividing, I'm reading from the top, this is what I wrote there. We're dividing the observances of the Seder into 4 categories, okay? And we're ranking them 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of hierarchy of most important to less important. So number 1 is going to be the most, number 2, second, 3, and so on. So as follows. The first category is, sorry, this is going to be an Ashkenazic pronunciation, mitzvos d'oraisa. If you're going to do a Sephardic pronunciation, it's going to be mitzvot d'oraita, which translates as biblical mitzvahs. Sorry? I started writing it in Sephardic pronunciation, and then I kept on realizing that I wasn't doing it right. So I just decided I'm going to go with the way how my brain thinks about it and leave it that way and let everybody else figure it out. Okay, so level 1 is biblical mitzvahs. So define that: commandments stated in the Torah. So there's certain commandments Torah says that on this night you should do X. Those are biblical commandments. Number 2 is mitzvahs derabanan, or rabbinic mitzvahs. So these are observances commanded by our sages. So our sages said, do X. It's not stated in the Torah, but our sages said to do X. Number 3, and here's where it gets a little tricky. These are takonas chachamim, loosely translates as rabbinic instructions. They're not mitzvahs per se, but they are instructions by the very same sages who did those mitzvahs. So the sages did a couple of things, or many things. Some things they said, this is a mitzvah, do it. And then there are things that are just instructions to do, but they don't get classified as quote unquote mitzvah. So the way I define it here is rabbinic instructions primarily concerned with the manner of mitzvah observance. So say, okay, we'll see some examples, but let's say Shabbos would be an example. The mitzvah is to keep Shabbos, and our sages say to keep Shabbos properly, avoid muktzah. So muktzah is not a commandment of the sages, but it's an institution, it's an instruction of the sages in how you should observe the mitzvah, right? So on Seder night, we're also going to have those things. We're going to have instructions from the sages telling us how to properly observe the various mitzvahs. So that's level 3. So biblical commandments, rabbinic commandments, and rabbinic instructions. And finally, number 4, zecher in Hebrew, or in English, symbolism. We're still on top page 2. Observances instructed by sages, or those that have emerged through custom in the last couple thousand years, and they are to invoke remembrances and symbolisms of events or ideas. So you have this to remember that, this to remember that, do this to remember this, and so on. So those could be from the sages. They could have emerged in generations after. Various communities have adopted various different customs all around category number 4 here, which is zecher, to remember certain things. Okay, so it's important to understand this because you read a lot in the Haggadah that, oh, this is to remember that. It's true that, let's say, matzah is to remember the fact that they rushed out of Egypt. It's true. It is to remember that we rushed out of Egypt. But primarily, it's in category 1. It's a biblical commandment. Thou shalt eat matzah. Right? So don't let anything get lost in category number 4. There are certain things that are in category 4 that are exclusively there just as custom to remember certain things. And if they are missing, it's not as if like the entirety of your Seder collapsed. But then there are other things that are biblically mandated or rabbinically mandated. And if you're missing those, then you didn't really do a Seder properly. Right? You're missing from the essence of the Seder. Okay, we clear so far in these 4 categories? Yep. Yeah. When we see the examples of the 4 categories, it'll become more clear. So now we're going to go through each of the 4 categories, see what exists at the Seder night in each of the categories. Again, we'll discuss the basics of how to observe them and then the meaning behind it for each item. We clear? Any comments, questions before we continue?
Question.
Yeah.
Zecher symbolism, is that what we say, like minhag? Like,
okay, so it's a good question because I could have divided it in more because there are certain symbolisms that are like instructed by the sages and certain symbolisms that came hundreds of years later. Some are very recent, right? So I kind of put them all into one category, but it's not really quite fair because some of them are much more weighty than others. But again, for the purposes of this, it would be endless if we gave like all the classifications possible. That's a good question though. Anything else before we go forward? Okay, so then category number 1, our little box there, mitzvahs deraisa. So you can see there's the columns, what the mitzvah is, notes on how to observe it, and then notes on the meaning of the mitzvah. So the first and primary mitzvah is the mitzvah to eat matzah. I'm making this emphasis because often the matzah is understood in like the symbolism category, and therefore, whatever, I'll eat a couple bites, and I symbolically did what I had to, right? Isn't the point just to remember we escaped Egypt? So if I eat 5 bites, I did the symbolism, right? I got the remembrance. I remember that we left Egypt, but we're forgetting this is a mitzvah. The same way you stop and pause to think when you light your Shabbos candles. The same thing is true of matzah. It's a mitzvah. It's true. God says, eat the matzah to remember that we left Egypt. That's true. But at the core, it's a mitzvah. And observe it and treat it like a mitzvah. Not something you do symbolically, but something you do because it's a mitzvah. Like eating Shabbos candles, lighting Shabbos candles, or whatever other mitzvahs we're going to be doing with intentionality. We should know that when we eat our matzah. So as such, here are the notes on the observances. A minimum that one must eat is 25.6 grams. I'm going to stop and give a plug to this Haggadah here, because that's where I got the number from. If you're looking for Haggadah that's not just instruction, but has commentary and insight, I'm not paid to do this. This is a really, really good Haggadah. It's published by the Chabad Central Publishing House in New York. The author, I think, is Marcus. And I have a pretty good collection of Haggadahs that are mostly Hebrew. This English one is better than half my Hebrew ones. It's really, really good in terms of like history, commentary, simplified instructions, clear commentary. It's a really, really good Haggadah if you want to get just more than do, stand, sit, read, eat. You want to get more than that, this is a really, really good option.
More juice.
So in here, he has like a layout of how much you have to eat of each item, and I got the numbers from this book. Okay, so I think it's a little less than an ounce, right? He gives, I'll tell you since you asked. I'll ask this. Yes, practically speaking. Hold on a second. He's got here a whole thing on the. Where did it go? I'm sorry. Here's a section no, I can't find it, you see? Okay, here we are. 1 kazayit of matzah, which is the minimum, is a fraction less than 1 ounce, 25.6 grams. It is to remember though, so depending on the kind of matzah you have, right? Hand-baked matzah vary in both size and density, right? So to get the exact number is easy. Nonetheless, the average hand-baked matzah has diameters of 10 and a half inches and weighs 2.3 ounces, which is roughly 66 grams. So 1 kazayit of matzah, which is the minimal amount to be eaten, which is slightly less than 1 ounce, is a piece of 5 by 7 inches in area. How's that? How's that for precision? A little less than half. Less than half a round matzah. Sorry, 5 by 7 inches is even less than half. Not great. Sorry, 5 by 7 inches. That's what they said here.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
You should be full out.
Yes. So
Just thinking about it.
right, but that's the mitzvah, is to eat that amount. Yeah, that's a good advice. Okay, by rabbinic instruction, we actually eat a second measure. We're not going to get into that, but again, the basic biblical mitzvah is to eat that amount of matzah, and it should be eaten within the span of, it's right here, between 4 and 7 minutes without interruption. So it's a mitzvah. It's like you pause and think and concentrate on lighting your Shabbos candles. So stop, pause, and eat your mitzvah matzah. So that's as far as the mitzvah observance goes. Of course, there's a brachas we do, follow the instructions, but this is the basic mitzvah, to eat that matzah. Of everything of the Seder night, if you're having your guests or if someone out there in the world is not doing anything, they should do this on the Seder night. Everybody has to do this. This is the mitzvah. This is the mitzvah of the night, is matzah. So we'll get to the leaning in a second, right? So that's going to be in one of the other categories. Yeah. That's why I'm making those distinctions to know what goes where. Because the matzah is the essential mitzvah, the eating of the matzah. Okay, now notes on the meaning of the matzah. So 4 things are right here about the meaning of the mitzvah of matzah. Number 1, it is the only mitzvah which we actually ingest. Meaning every other mitzvah is a mitzvah we engage in. We act, we do the mitzvah. So the mitzvah exists outside and we engage in it. The one mitzvah that we intake is matzah. That in of itself is a unique idea, right? Food literally becomes part of your body. And here, actual substance of a mitzvah, if you want to call it that, becomes part of your actual body. So there's something beautiful about that. And then, sorry? Yeah. Okay, so we'll see soon the wine is not biblical, right? It can be one of the other categories, but yes, that's true. And the maror also, we'll get to all of them. So this is the only biblical mitzvah, let's rephrase that, in which we ingest. In temple times, there would have been more because there's meat in the temple that would have been a mitzvah to eat as well. But this is the only mitzvah obligation of eating, biblically speaking, is matzah today, yeah? Period. There is no other biblical commandment to consume anything other than the matzah nowadays. Temple times, there would have been other things. But today, this is the only mitzvah that is biblically mandated to ingest is matzah. So that in and of itself makes it something special. Yeah. Additionally, you have these other 3 items. Humility, right? We all know that's what matzah symbolizes. It's flat, it doesn't rise. We are actually particular to have our matzah shaped. If you look carefully, our matzah is shaped like a receptacle, like a bowl, sort of. It's by design that way, on purpose. Yep, we want it to be like a humble receiver. The idea to be open to receiving, humility. And the Zohar tells us that matzah is both the bread of faith on night number 1 and the bread of healing on night number 2. And the intention here is healing of the body, actually. So there's a lot in the matzah there in ingesting faith, ingesting humility, and ingesting this healing, all of which I assume we can all use a little bit of, at least a little. Okay, so that's as far as matzah goes. We clear so far? To kind of see the structure of how we're going? Yeah. Okay. There's one more biblical mandate unique to the night of the Seder. And that is telling the story of the Exodus. This is an important mitzvah. And this is one of those mitzvahs that get very lost because the whole Magid, right, after you break the metal matzah and the kids start asking the questions, it's like this whole pages and pages we read. until we start getting to eating matzah maror and everything. And it's there that often we're not sure what's the primary, what's the secondary, right? Because we all know that statement, Kol amar b'harei meshubach. Whoever does more, it's virtuous, like the more the merrier. So you want to talk about the story of the Exodus all night, go for it, right? But where's the mitzvah? Every mitzvah's got to have like, the qualification. Like, how do I know I was yotzeh? How do I know I fulfilled the commandment of the mitzvah? This is a really actually tricky question to answer that question. Exactly which paragraph do you have to read in order to fulfill the mitzvah of retelling the story? But at least I'm going to give you these three things to keep in mind, and you'll see them. If you read the Haggadah in English, you'll see all these three things. Number one is the retelling of the story should be in question and answer form, right? You have the four questions, you have the four sons that ask questions. That's number one. The retelling of the story should be in question and answer form, which is baked into the Seder. But at least know that you should be doing that there's manashtana and avodah mayinu, the first two paragraphs, the question and the answer. Some of the other paragraphs are just additives, but asking the questions and then giving the answer, that's at the core of the mitzvah, okay? Item number two is, is the arc narrative. Every story has to have a narrative, right? So what should be the narrative of the story when we tell the story of the Exodus? So the narrative is, and I'm quoting here from the Mishnah, it should begin in, quote, shame and end in praise, which means essentially the story should start out like any good story, where the beginning starts out where things are not so great, and then they end where they're amazing. That's the arc narrative. So there's actually two ways we preserve this. If you pay attention closely to the Seder, you'll see it. One is we started off as slaves. Avodah mayinu, we were slaves. Now we're free. That's arc narrative, right? We start off in a negative, we're slaves. We end free. Or actually option two, later in the Haggadah, look out for this. This is an important paragraph where we describe how once upon a time we were idol worshippers, place of shame. Our ancestors before Abraham were idol worshippers. And now we serve God. So it's either a physical narrative, physically slaves, now physically free, or a spiritual narrative. We used to be idol worshippers, and now we are privileged and chosen to serve Hashem. So those are two narratives you'll find in the Haggadah, both of which are important fulfilling this mitzvah. And number three, and this is probably the most important of all of them, is towards the end of the Haggadah, towards the end of Maggid, there's a paragraph there which describes the Pesach that we eat is to remember, right? This matzah that we eat is to remember. This mar that we eat is to remember. You know those three paragraphs there? Crucial, read those. That's a very central part of fulfilling the mitzvah to retell the story. Okay, we clear on that so far? Yeah?
Yep.
So that's mitzvah number two, which is biblical. Note, I put this here before Maror. Maror is not here yet. Just we understand the hierarchy of mitzvahs here. We associate Maror as a big part of the Seder, but retelling the story is a biblical mandate. As we'll see soon, Maror is actually only rabbinic. I shouldn't say only, but Maror is rabbinic. On cue. Okay, sorry. Okay, so what are the notes on the meaning of the mitzvah to retell the story? So number one is, it describes a relationship with God. One of the key ideas of the fact that Hashem took us out of Egypt is to understand one of the revolutionary ideas that's achieved at the moment the Jews leave Egypt is that the world understood on a national level that God is invested in what happens in creation. Until such time, Abraham was in communication with Hashem, and our forefathers were somewhat in communication with Hashem. But for the most of the universe, God created the world, and now the world operates on its own. With the Jews coming out of Egypt, now there's a relationship with Hashem with a specific nation. This is the story of our origin, if you will. So there's the understanding that we have a unique position and a unique relationship with Hashem. There was a world, and the world was operating on its own. There was masters and there were slaves. And then God says, here's my people, and now we're going to build a relationship. That's really what the story is, right? That arc narrative. We were slaves, now we're free. Hashem took us out. We used to worship idols, now Hashem selected and said, I want a relationship with you. That's message number one of the mitzvah. Message two is, right, the mitzvah had to be done in question-answer form, which is a good lesson in education. If you read the Manashtana, and then you read the entirety of the Haggadah, you'll be hard pressed to find answers to all the questions. In fact, the question of why we dip twice isn't answered anywhere. So you're making the kid ask questions, not even answering them. What's the point? That is the point. Engage in curiosity. There's an important element here. When you're telling a story, you don't just make the kid sit down and say, listen. To get the kid in, so make him curious, and then you can respond once the kid's curious. But first of all, get the kid curious, get the kid asking. It's already another lesson in this mitzvah of retelling a story. Number 3, a sense of history and purpose. Understanding that we belong to a story. We don't just exist by accident because our parents happen to have met. There's a story, and we're part of the story, and there's a history, and therefore there's a purpose to where we're going. We're part of a larger narrative. We're part of a larger story. I may have shared this before, but years ago I read a book written by a non-Jew. If I shared this before, my apologies. It's written by a non-Jew, and it's called Seven Character Traits of the Jewish People that everybody can learn from, or something like that. Essentially, he was a guy who wanted to see why Jews were successful and how we can model that for other peoples. And he goes through seven things that he discovered or decided was the reason for Jewish success. Of course, education, family, all that stuff is all in there. And then one of the things he said there that really stuck with me was, he said, every Jew can tell you the story of 3 to 4 generations back. Or not every, but many. I tell you, my grandparents were here, my great-grandparents were there. We went from here to there because the Jews weren't allowed to be here. So we had to go there, and then they were kicked out of there. We came from here, and that's why I'm here today. Right? And he said that this helps children and Jews believe in that they have a purpose because they know their story. They know how they got here. And it's a very important thing. And we put ourselves in that context. And that's part of the mitzvah of telling the story of the Exodus to understand we're part of a very long story. It starts 3,500 years ago. Hashem chose us. He gave us a mission. And ever since then, we've been on this journey of fulfilling that mission. Just an accident. We're part of a story. And we're relevant in that story. It's a very big part of the mitzvah of retelling the story. And finally, a sense of gratitude. When you understand history and you understand where you came from, and you understand that there were people that made huge sacrifices for you to be where you are today. You understand that the hand of God was there all along the way to make sure you are where you are today. That gives a very humbling, back to the other mitzvah of matzah, and grateful attitude about who we are and what we are, understanding that you're part of this story and part of this narrative. So that's as far as the biblical mitzvahs that are unique to the Seder night. There are other biblical mitzvahs that we do, so I put them there on the bottom, but they're not unique to the Seder night. So we always have a mitzvah to make Kiddush Friday night, or on a regular Yom Tov, we're obliged to declare the sanctity of the day by a Kiddush, so we do it at the Seder also. And also there's a biblical commandment to say the grace after meals every time you have a meal, so we do that too. But those aren't unique to the Seder night, so we're kind of glossing over them, although there are also biblical commandments. Okay, we clear so far? Mm-hmm. Any thoughts, comments, questions before we go to the rabbinic commandments? Yeah.
Please add the same contradiction between retelling the story and living it, as if we were also living it.
Right.
I always struggle between these two, between attaching more weight to the story or attaching more weight to the possibility that we have.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question quickly for the recording and then I'll address it. So the question is a very good question. Where's the focus, on the story or on my being part of it? Right? And I think the two are intertwined. The two are connected. If you want to know your own story of liberation, know the story of our people's liberation. You want this story of our people's liberation to be meaningful, understand how it's connected to your own personal liberation. So the two are really intertwined. Our personal liberation and collective liberation are one, and they feed into each other. Okay, so now let's get to our rabbinic commandments on page 3. So again, these rabbinic commandments, again, we define those as commandments our sages said, do X. Not just don't do muktzah, like on Shabbos, don't touch certain things you're not allowed to because it might lead you to violate Shabbos. That's not in this category. This is category of mitzvah where the sages enacted a observance, a mitzvah. Actually, a classic example of that would be your Shabbos candles. Shabbos candles are a rabbinic mitzvah. So is Hanukkah, so is Purim, so is washing your hands before we eat bread. All of those are rabbinic mitzvahs. They're not there as safeguards for anything. They're not there to help you augment some other mitzvah. They are self-standing commandments from our sages. So on the Seder night, we have 4/5, or I should say 3/5. And I'll go through them and we'll explain why. Okay, so the first is the mitzvah to drink 4 cups of wine, right? So notes on the observance. Again, it's not just symbolism, sips of wine because I'm remembering freedom. It's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to ingest the wine. And therefore, there's a minimum requirement, which is 3.5 ounces per cup. Pro tip, get small cups. I think Shochat sell them. So as long as they're bigger than 3.5 ounces,
They have the right size. Right size.
they're a little bigger, I think. They're a bit bigger. Yeah. So that's number 1. And number 2 is each cup should be accompanied by another recitation. So you're not just drinking 4 cups in a row. That wouldn't qualify as the mitzvah. They have to be divided, and they're divided, each cup being given another recitation at the Seder. So Kiddush, the story, Magid, the benching, the grace after meals, the Birkat HaMazon, and then the 4th one, Hallel. So that's as far as the observance goes. Okay. The meaning of it, this we all write the 4 expressions of redemption. There are 4 different expressions or terms used in the verse to describe God redeeming the Jewish people. And to commemorate each of those 4, we drink another cup of wine. And then the other meaning we have here is appreciation of Hashem, his salvation, and his mitzvot. So to explain, the wine is opposite to the matzah. Matzah is flat, humility, and flavorless. So it's all about putting myself aside and just saying, what do you have? Receiving. Wine is the contrary. It's supposed to be full of flavor. You're supposed to enjoy it. In fact, if the wine is sour, for example, you may not have fulfilled the mitzvah of drinking wine. You may have to drink another cup that isn't sour, because it has to be proper, normal wine, actually. So it's the opposite of the matzah in the sense that the matzah is about humility and just accepting whatever it is Hashem says, irrespective of how I feel about it. The wine is about developing an appreciation for being in the service of Hashem, an appreciation for who Hashem is and for what mitzvahs are. So you have these like 2 mitzvahs that like biblical and rabbinic, and they combine together to create, on the one hand, humility, matzah, on the other hand, the appreciation in the wine, right? A wine, you want it to age longer. Matzah, you want it to be baked quickly. In fact, opposite. Quick humility versus slow appreciation, it's aged, and so on. Okay, so the second mitzvah we have to do on the Seder night is, the rabbinic one, is to eat maror. Maror is a rabbinic mitzvah. So in the notes on the observance, you see in the middle there, right? It is only biblically required when eaten with the Pesach offering. The only time the Torah instructs to eat maror is as follows. The Torah gives a whole instruction how you should prepare your Pesach offering. And then it says, you shall eat it with matzah and maror. That's the only time the Torah says to eat maror, is to eat it with the Pesach offering. So because today we don't have a Pesach offering, it's a rabbinic mitzvah to eat maror. Right? So if we're putting the hierarchies of mitzvahs, matzah or telling the story is on the highest level, and then 4 cups of wine and maror is tier 2. They're both rabbinic mitzvahs. Okay? But again, like every mitzvah, it's not just symbolism, it's an actual mitzvah. You have to eat a certain amount, which is a little less than 20 grams. For the layman, how much is that? Give me a second. Go back to our little nifty Haggadah here. Okay. Maror, which is 2/3 of an ounce. How's that? A little bit more, actually. Because because that's only if you're using the horseradish. If you're using lettuce, it's got to be a bit bigger. That's why I wrote that. Sorry. It is slightly higher, namely a little more than 2/3 of an ounce. 19.2 grams.
Lettuce is qualified, but that's what
With so maybe at the core, yes, but it should be a mix of both, at least by our practice. So that's why I wrote a little bit about 20 grams. It's not a lot of maror, by the way. It's not so much, right? Okay, but that's the mitzvah to do that. And of course, the meaning, all the way on the right, is first of all remembering the bitterness of slavery. That's the basic meaning. We're eating bitter herbs because it was a bitter time in Egypt. But on a more spiritual level, part of the process of redemption is to introspect on the state of bitterness that one is in. Meaning to say, one who's enslaved and doesn't recognize that they are enslaved cannot emerge from slavery. You're stuck in thinking that slavery is good. So the first thing is to understand the bitterness of the current state. And that's what the maror is. To understand the bitterness of the state we are in, and then with humility, we can come out. Right? So that's what the maror is. And here I write, and you'll see in a moment why, that this maror specifically is to introspection on the bitterness of being distant from Hashem, caused by the state of reality. Meaning to say that the state of reality we are in is currently exile. We're not in Egypt, but we are in exile. So the current state of reality is that I do not see God everywhere. That in and of itself should invoke a certain sense of quote unquote bitterness, and that this is not the comfortable state of the Jew. The comfortable state of the Jew is in our Holy Land, in our temple, with our king, where we can see Hashem, where we have prophets speaking. That's the comfortable Jewish state. And step one of getting out of exile is understanding the bitterness of it. So that's as far as the meaning of the mitzvah goes. You clear so far?
Mhm.
Okay, so I said that there's 3/5 rabbinic mitzvahs because maror breaks off into two more. Number one is eating korach. So eating the korach, eating the sandwich, right, which we do, matzah and maror combination. So if you look at notes and observances I write, Hillel's version of maror. I'm not going to explain this too deeply, but essentially, Hillel would eat in temple times matzah and maror together, and along with the Pesach offering. Today we have no Pesach offering, so in Hillel's view, if you want to do the rabbinic mitzvah of eating maror, you have to eat it with matzah. That's the bottom line. So maror is broken into two: maror and then sandwich. Maror just for the opinion of the sages of the time, and sandwich for Hillel. Was that somewhat clear? I'm not sure if that was 100% clear. Meaning to say there's a rabbinic commandment to eat maror. How do you have to eat that maror? Opinion A, just eat maror. Opinion B, which is Hillel, says, you want to do the rabbinic mitzvah to eat maror, you got to eat maror and matzah together. That's the sandwich. It's actually an observance of the mitzvah of maror, but just in Hillel's view. So there's two views on how to do maror, and one of them is Hillel's view, which is to have matzah and maror together.
What's the other view?
To have maror alone. So we eat both to satisfy both opinions about maror.
But because you said, okay, so the other view is from the.
Sages, the Chachamim, the Hillel's contemporaries.
Okay,
Right?
got it.
So Hillel's contemporaries are of the view that in order for you to fulfill the mitzvah of maror, you got to eat maror plain. Hillel's view is if you want to fulfill the mitzvah of maror, you got to eat maror with matzah. Okay? So the sandwich is actually just a break off of the maror mitzvah. And therefore, you have to eat matzah and maror in the same measurements of matzah and maror stated earlier. Right?
Yeah.
In fact, a little detail that I added here, which is you're actually supposed to eat them in the same bite, quite literally. Like in one bite, matzah and maror at once. Right? Right, but not as if like the maror is stuck in the middle somewhere and the matzah's up here and you get like, you eat like half a matzah till you get to the maror in the middle. Got to be an actual sandwich in which like one bite you're getting both matzah and maror together. That's the way to do the mitzvah. Sorry?
Eventually you get to the maror.
Right, but that would be a problematic version of doing the mitzvah. Yeah. If you're
Bite
literally
one,
bite one,
fold
matzah
it.
and maror together. Yes.
So you
Yeah.
have to fold your matzah small.
Or just bring the maror to the edge, I suppose. Or fold it, I guess.
But when you get to the
But
bottom,
it's not so, it
like
doesn't have to be so much. It's not so much. Anyway,
We learn it.
yeah,
There's
sorry.
a lot more matzah than there is maror, even the right method.
Right.
So yeah, at some point it's now we're having.
At some point, you're having matzah plain, yes, but at least certainly at the beginning, as you're acquired, start with matzah and maror together, yes.
Push it up.
Okay, so because the mitzvah of korach is an extension of matzah, of maror, therefore the blessings you make of matzah and maror cover your sandwich, which is why from when you start eating your matzah until after you finish eating your sandwich, no talking or interruptions, because you're fulfilling 3 mitzvahs in a row, or No, because the bracha of matzah and the bracha of maror extends to the Haggadah sandwich. Because that whole mitzvah, the sandwich was only to,
When you wash, the first bite of bread is your yaitza. You can talk after.
there's no mitzvah to eat challah on Friday night. There's a mitzvah to eat a meal of matzah. And then there's a mitzvah to eat a meal of maror. And then there's a mitzvah to eat a meal of matzah and maror combined. So you have to make the brachas extend all the way to the end. Okay. Okay. Sorry. The bracha I'm referring to is the bracha over the mitzvah, not the bracha over eating matzah. Right? There's a bracha in hamotzi, and then there's a bracha al achilas. That bracha extends all the way to. Yeah.
Instructions.
No. Okay, if it's instructions, you may be allowed to. Okay, let's. Yeah. A lot of information. Oh yeah. Okay. Well, we'll move it along. Okay, so again, so we have a mitzvah rabbinically to eat maror with two versions of how to do that. One is to eat maror plain, one is to eat maror with the matzah. So we do both. We eat maror and then matzah, and because they're really one mitzvah, we do them all successively without interruption, preferably. So my mother asked about giving instructions. You're allowed to speak to give instructions because that does not constitute a break in your activity. You're still engaged in the action of eating when you're giving instructions. So if you say pass the charoset, you're allowed to do that. But to chat about anything other than the mitzvahs, one should not. So if you're saying new on, definitely. That's definitely interruption. Okay, so as for the meaning behind this mitzvah, so again, the primary here is maror, right? Like I explained before, there's a mitzvah to eat maror, and there's two ways to do that, either maror alone or maror with matzah, which means the primary here is, again, this introspection on the state of bitterness. But this time, the bitterness is combined with humility, with matzah. So what does that mean? To combine introspection over the state of bitterness with humility. So here, the introspection is on the bitterness, not of the state of existence, but the bitterness of what I brought upon myself, my own misbehavior. So I've caused a greater distance with Hashem than there was before I did anything. The world itself is already distant from Hashem. And then in my behavior, I made at least myself a little more detached from Hashem. So in this introspection is also a sense of humility, right? And it's important to have that humility because if you don't have that humility, then all I'm doing is self-loathing. And self-loathing is not healthy. It doesn't get you anywhere. Just feeling that I'm a failure doesn't help me do anything. There's humility that has to come along with the introspection. So I know what I did, and it wasn't a good thing. It's a bitter activity, but I have humility enough to accept that it wasn't right. And in so doing, I can liberate myself from it instead of dwelling on, I'm horrible, I messed up. So if you're going to introspect on the state of my own personal bitterness, it's got to be combined with matzah, with humility. So that way I can get out of it and not just be stuck inside of it. Right? So the first maror was to introspect on the state of reality. The reality is it's a distant world. It's a world of exile, and that's just the reality. It's bitter. Nothing to do with me. It's just the way the world is created, and it's not comfortable. The second level here is on my own personal behavior. And when I'm going to introspect on the own bitterness of my own state of behavior, then it has to be combined with humility. Otherwise, I get stuck in there, and I never escape from it. So there's humility to say, I know I messed up. I know it was wrong. I know it's bitter, and now we can move on. So that's the matzah and maror combined. Okay. So as I mentioned, we're going back to now the fourth mitzvah. Fourth rabbinic mitzvah, which again is an extension of maror, is to eat charoset. It's actually a rabbinic commandment to eat charoset. But this is the only one that has no minimum requirement. So you can eat as little as you'd like. Everything else, you have to have this amount, that amount. Charoset, we actually do specifically a little bit. But there is no minimum requirement. It's just got to be dipped. That's the main point. It's an extension of the mitzvah of maror. Maror being, therefore, there's no special blessing for the charoset because it's extension of the maror. And we use it twice by either of the two marors, the original maror and then the maror with the sandwich, because both of those are really just maror. So you got to have charoset with both of those. Are we clear? Am I going a little too fast?
What?
In theory, but it's tuffle anyway. It'd be tuffle anyway to the maror. So the Rebbe actually writes about this, about why we don't make a bracha on the charoset. And the bottom line is the Rebbe learns that the charosis is secondary to the maror, both in eating, because it's a dip, and because it's an extension of the mitzvah. So on the mitzvah account and on the eating account, the charoset is secondary to the maror, and therefore covered by the bracha of the maror, essentially. Sorry?
Whatever the main thing.
Whatever the main food item, like when you have a dip, like if you take a vegetable and dip it into something, you make a bracha on the vegetable, not the dip. Right? The same things with the charoset. Even though it is a mitzvah, but its mitzvah is only an extension of the maror, and therefore second to the maror, and therefore covered by the maror bracha. Okay, just too much detail maybe. So in terms of the meaning of this mitzvah, it's an extension of maror. Maror is the bitter state of exile, and this is a very specific type of exile, which is the mortar, the bricks and mortar that they made. Now, as far as the message goes, there's a deeper message here. It's a beautiful message, which is, on the one hand, the charoset is to remember the mortar, which is our enslavement. On the other hand, it's made of fruit, which is like delightful stuff, right? So it's like this weird combination of it's bitter and delightful. And the way Chassidus explains this is that charoset symbolizes the transformation of someone in a state of brick and mortar, where it's the core of just the worst kind of bitterness, transformed to the greatest delight, the fruits that are the ingredients of the charoset. So it's this ultimate transformation represented by the charoset from bitterness to delight. It's mortar, but it's also fruits. Sorry? So it's bitter and sweet simultaneously. That's the point. It's an extension of maror, but it itself really is sweet, right? You're making an eight if you eat it on its own.
But we see that it's always like that, the opposite with the wine and the matzah.
The wine and the matzah, that's right. The matzah and the maror, and then now the maror and the charoset. Yes, very good. Okay, finally, the last rabbinic mitzvah we have is to recite the Hallel. It's a mitzvah to recite the Hallel on the night of the Seder. Now, as far as the observance goes, you'll notice in the Haggadah that the Hallel is split in two. Half of it is read before we drink the second cup of wine. The other half is read after we finish our meal, what we refer to as, quote, Hallel. But really, it's an extension of the Hallel we started earlier. And this is the reason why we don't make a bracha. When you do Hallel in shul, right, you make a bracha before you say Hallel. At the Seder night, we don't make the bracha. And the reason is because it's split in half. Because you do half Hallel before you eat a meal, and then half Hallel after the meal. So when you split the mitzvah in half, it's kind of awkward to make a bracha. And therefore, for those who are davening the evening service earlier that evening, I should say, they would be saying Hallel in the evening service, in Ma'ariv, and make the bracha then. On Pesach night, it's the only time we do Hallel at night, and we make a bracha on the Hallel at Ma'ariv. But at the Seder, we don't make a bracha because it's split in half. Okay. As far as the messages of the Hallel, Hallel is all praise. It's all a song. It's all a praise for Hashem. So the first of all is gratitude. Getting back to what we talked about before, understanding where we came from, understanding who we are, giving ourselves context to our story. There's a sense of gratitude, and Hallel is our expression of that gratitude. Another theme that's pervasive throughout Hallel is divine grandeur. It's on the bottom of page 3. Divine grandeur, the grandness of Hashem's creation, the grandness of the world. That's all expressed in Hallel. And specifically, if you look carefully, you'll see how Hallel really is a description of how all of creation sings to Hashem. If you read the English, it's very beautiful. And the whole Hallel describes how all of creation is singing from Hashem. You know, the mountains and the oceans and the birds and everybody's singing to Hashem. And in the center of this like orchestra is the Jew standing there singing his Hallel. That's kind of, if you read the translation and you put yourself in there, it's a nice place to be. If you get into the Hallel and sing with it, you'll and you read the words, you'll see how this really all comes together, and all the whole story and everything we're talking about, and the fact that the redemptive story, and the fact that it's our history and that we're part of a narrative, all that comes together in this great like cosmic song of Hallel, at the center of which is me screaming on the top of my lungs, or all of you. Missing the best part. Okay, so there's a lot more as you can see, but I think. Sorry. I think these are the main things. I think we'll stop here, but you have the other 2 pages there. You can go through them yourself. It's very clear now that you know what things are. I think that might be a good idea. But these are the main mitzvahs. Everything else is either in, like, for example, someone mentioned leaning earlier. That's part of Takanas Chachamim, the sage's instruction. How to properly observe the Seder night is to lean. But it's not like mitzvah to lean, right? It's one of those things that are meant to,
Men, right?
yeah, it's only for men.
Right.
But that's one of those things that are not an independent mitzvah per se. It's a discussion about that, but essentially it's not really an independent mitzvah so much as the proper way to observe the Seder night is by leaning, right? And the same thing with dipping twice. It's the way to get the kids' curiosity. Breaking the middle matzah. It's the right way. It's the right way to recite the Haggadah when you have a broken matzah. Same thing with Afikoman. We want to remember the Pesach offering, right? So those are Takanos Chachamim, a sage's enactment on how to observe the mitzvahs. And then the last page, you read it on your own, you'll see more. There are things that are to remember: the egg, the zroa, the cup of Eliyahu Hanavi. These are all customary things. Some, to your point earlier, some are from the sages and some emerged in generations later, but they're all there for symbolisms, right? So you have now, I hope, a clarity on like the hierarchy of your Seder. You have matzah, we're telling the story at the top. You have maror, 4 cups of wine, which is korach and charoset and halal on tier 2. Tier 3 is the way in which you should observe these mitzvahs, breaking the middle matzah and dipping twice and leaning and afikomen. And then finally, all these other things that are like additives that are there to remember certain things. So when you go through your Seder, first of all, take note of all these things. And also remember, don't miss the main points. You know, people are very excited about having the zero and the beitza, but you got to sit down and have the matzah. That would be a much more important thing than making sure you have zeroa or beitza. I'm not, God forbid, making light of these things. I'm very particular to have my zeroa and my beitza there. I'm just making the point that when you're conducting your whole Seder and running your whole household, make sure you have your matzah. That's really an important mitzvah. Make sure you read those parts of the Haggadah that tell the story. That's the mitzvah. Make sure you eat your maror at least once. Eat the sandwich. Make sure you do those things that are the primary mitzvahs. And enjoy the halal. It's fun. Okay. Thank you all for listening. And have a wonderful evening and a happy Passover to everybody. You're welcome to keep these.
Give an extra one, right? Chance?
Yes, I plenty. And thank you for the opportunity to share with you.